Out on the edge of town, where the dust never truly settled and every stranger carried a story, something small happened that would ripple through years like a stone tossed into still water. It started with $7. And a man who refused to look away. Inside a roadside diner just off a sunburned stretch of highway, a father and his daughter were celebrating the kind of news that makes a hard life feel briefly weightless. They were laughing, sharing stories, holding tight to a moment that felt like hope. And then they noticed her. An elderly woman sitting alone at the counter, counting a few wrinkled bills over and over, as if wishing the numbers would change. She had only $7. The afternoon sun hammered down on the street outside, baking the pavement and bleaching the sky. Inside Rosie's diner, though, the air was cool and smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions. Margaret Sullivan sat at the counter, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the menu she knew she couldn't afford. 74 years old, and her disability check wouldn't arrive for another 3 days. Those $7 were all she had. She counted them again, then again. Coffee, maybe, toast if she stretched it. That was all. The waitress, a kind young woman named Carmen, stood nearby pretending to wipe the counter. She had seen this before. People staring at menus like they were maps to a life just out of reach. "Take your time, honey," Carmen said gently. "No rush." But there was always a rush when you were poor. Always the quiet pressure of knowing you were taking up space someone else could pay for. Always the small sting of shame. Margaret lowered her eyes. Once, she had walked into places like this and never looked at the price. Once, people had known her name. A bell chimed over the door, and the sound of a child's laughter filled the room. A man stepped in, broad-shouldered and worn from years of honest work. Beside him was a girl, maybe 11, bright-eyed and full of restless energy. James Carter stood just over 6 feet tall, his hands scarred from decades turning wrenches. Oil stains clung to his shirt no matter how hard he scrubbed. He owned a small auto shop down the road, and it was enough to keep food on the table. Most months, his daughter Destiny bounced beside him, barely able to contain herself. "Daddy, can I really order anything?" she asked, her voice bubbling over with excitement. James smiled. "Anything you want. Today's special." In truth, his wallet held only $40. Rent was due in 2 days. But some moments mattered more than numbers. And this was one of them. Destiny had just been accepted into the Los Angeles Youth Chorus. Out of hundreds of kids, she had earned one of 30 spots. Her mama would have been so proud. 3 years had passed since Angela Carter lost her fight with cancer. Before she died, she had taken James's hand and made him promise 2 things. "Take care of our girl," she had whispered. "And don't let her stop singing. She has a gift." James had kept that promise. Voice lessons when he could afford them. A second-hand keyboard. Church choir every Sunday. Late nights fixing cars just to pay for one more class. So today, he was celebrating. Even if it meant stretching the last of his money. Destiny chose Rosie's Diner because she loved their chocolate milkshakes. As they slid into their seats, Destiny's voice filled the room with excitement. "Mr. Henderson said I have perfect pitch. That means I can hear a note and sing it exactly right. He said it's rare." James listened, smiling, letting her joy carry him. But then his eyes drifted to the counter. He saw the woman. He recognized the look in her shoulders right away. The quiet defeat. The way her fingers clutched those few dollars. He had seen that look before. In his grandmother. In his mother. In himself. "Daddy," Destiny whispered, tugging his sleeve. "That lady looks sad." James followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said softly. "She does." For a moment, he hesitated. He had bills to pay. Responsibilities. But his mother's voice echoed in his head the way it always did. "We don't have much," she used to say. "But we always have enough to share." He stood. "Come on," he told Destiny. They walked over slowly, careful not to startle her. Margaret looked up as they approached, her eyes guarded. "Excuse me, ma'am," James said, his voice gentle and steady. "Mind if we join you? My daughter and I are celebrating something special. And my mama always said celebrations are better when you share them." Margaret blinked, surprised. "I'm James," he added. This is Destiny. Destiny climbed onto the stool beside her, smiling like they were already friends. I got into the youth chorus, she announced proudly. It's a big deal. Margaret felt something soften inside her chest. That is a big deal, she said quietly. What are you going to order? Destiny asked. Margaret hesitated. Oh, just coffee, maybe some toast. Destiny frowned. But it's a celebration. You should get the meatloaf. It smells amazing. James caught the look in Margaret's eyes. The longing she tried to hide. He didn't say another word. Carmen, he called gently. We're celebrating today. We'll have the meatloaf special for Miss. He paused. Margaret, she said softly. For Miss Margaret. Pancakes for Destiny. I'll take the turkey club. And 3 chocolate milkshakes. Margaret shook her head quickly. I can't let you do that. You don't even know me. James smiled. We're fixing that right now. As the food arrived, the conversation slowly began to flow. Destiny talked about her audition, her nerves, the moment she started singing and forgot to be afraid. My mama always said sing from your heart, she explained. Margaret's hand moved to her throat without thinking. I used to sing, she said quietly. Destiny's eyes widened. Really? A long time ago. James leaned forward. What kind of singing? Jazz, she replied. San Francisco. Back when the clubs were still alive with music. People used to call me Lady Maggie. James's eyebrows rose. Wait, my parents loved jazz. Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Margaret Sullivan. That Margaret Sullivan, she gave a small, sad smile. That was a lifetime ago. And just like that, the story spilled out. The accident, the tour bus tumbling down a cliff. The weeks in the hospital. The doctors telling her her voice would never be the same. Her husband gone. No children. No career. No one left. Now just a small room, thin walls, and a monthly check that barely kept her afloat. Destiny listened with tears in her eyes. That's so sad, she whispered. But you could still teach, right? The words seemed to hang in the air. Teach. Margaret had never let herself think about it. James studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. Our old voice teacher moved away, he said. We've been looking for someone new. Someone who understands more than just technique. Someone who knows what music means. Destiny's face lit up. You could teach me. Margaret felt fear rush in. I don't know if I remember how, she admitted. James shook his head gently. 20 years on stage doesn't disappear. And Destiny doesn't need perfect. She needs someone who sings from the soul. He hesitated, then continued. There's a room above my shop. I was going to rent it out, but never got around to it. You could use it to teach. Even live there. No rent. Just utilities. $30 a lesson. Twice a week. Margaret stared at him, stunned. $700 saved on rent. Food. Medicine. Stability. But more than that, purpose. Why would you do this? She asked. James met her eyes. Because I see someone who still has something to give. And maybe you need a second chance as much as we need a teacher. Destiny reached for her hand. Please say yes. Margaret looked at the little girl. At the man who spoke with quiet certainty. At the life she had been surviving instead of living. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. The next morning she showed up at Carter's Auto Repair with 2 worn suitcases and more hope than she'd felt in 24 years. The room above the shop was simple. Clean. Sunlight poured in through the windows. It felt like a beginning. A few days later, Destiny stood nervously in front of her for their first lesson. Sing something you know by heart, Margaret said. Destiny closed her eyes and began, Amazing Grace. And Margaret knew, the girl had a gift. A real one. They worked for hours. Breathing, posture, control, technique. Margaret corrected gently but firmly. When James came to pick her up, Destiny ran into his arms. Daddy, she knows everything. Margaret watched them from the doorway, something warm growing in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt useful again. 7 months passed. Destiny grew stronger, braver, better. Margaret pushed her hard, sometimes to the edge of tears. But she saw what the girl could become. And when the Christmas concert came, Destiny stood on that grand stage and sang like her soul was on fire. The audience rose to their feet. James cried openly. Margaret cried too, because she knew, in that moment, that her life hadn't ended when her voice was taken from her. It had simply changed direction. And it all began with $7, and a stranger who chose to care. Ruth never told herself she was letting them stay. She told herself she was fixing a problem that would turn into something worse by morning if she didn't. The babies lay near the stove, wrapped tight, their cries fading into tired whimpers that rose and fell like uneven breaths after a long run. The man stood just inside the doorway, hat twisting in his hands, shoulders drawn inward like the warmth itself might accuse him of taking too much. Ruth kept her back to him, moving briskly between kettle and cupboard, each step clipped and deliberate, as if speed alone could keep her from thinking. "You can sit," she said without turning. "Or don't. Either way, don't hover." "Yes, ma'am, thank you," he corrected himself quickly. She set the kettle on the stove and listened again, head tilted just slightly. One baby coughed, dry and shallow. Ruth crossed the room before she meant to, crouching low beside the blankets, pressing 2 fingers gently to the baby's ribs, counting the rise and fall without moving her lips. Her hands were steady, they always were when something mattered. "Fever's mild," she said. "Not dangerous yet." The man exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. "I didn't know what to do," he admitted quietly. "I tried everything." "I can see that," Ruth said sharper than she meant, then softened a fraction. "You can't rock a fever out of a body." She moved with quick efficiency, damp cloth, careful touch, small adjustments that eased the breathing just enough to notice. The crying slowed, not gone, but manageable. The man watched her like he was afraid to blink. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth stiffened. "A long time ago," she replied. "Doesn't matter now." The other baby fussed louder, offended by the attention being uneven. Ruth glanced over and sighed through her nose. "You hear that?" she muttered. "They always know." She lifted the second baby with a confidence that surprised even her, settling the small weight against her shoulder. The baby cried harder for a moment, then hitched, confused by the steady rhythm of Ruth's breathing. She rocked once without thinking, then twice. She caught herself and stopped, jaw tightening. "Here," she said briskly, handing the baby back once the breathing shifted. "They'll sleep some now, not all night." The man nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." Ruth turned away, scrubbing her hands at the sink longer than necessary. "You're not staying long," she said. "Soon as the sun's up, you move on." "I will," he said quickly. "I don't want trouble." "You already are," she muttered, the words heavier than she meant. Silence settled, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the uneven breaths of the babies. She poured hot water into a tin cup and set it near the blankets. "If they wake coughing again, warm cloth. Small feeds. Slow." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "My name's Daniel." Names had weight. Ruth dried her hands and nodded once. "Ruth." The night broke into pieces. Short stretches of sleep, crying, coughing, instructions murmured in the dark. Daniel followed carefully, clumsy but earnest. Each time he looked to her for reassurance, she pretended not to notice. She sat at the table, arms crossed, listening with half an ear, her body refusing rest even when the house stilled. Once, when a cry rose sharp and wrong, Ruth was on her feet before Daniel could stand, adjusting the baby's position, murmuring something low and soothing she hadn't planned to say. The crying eased. Ruth froze, realizing what she'd done, then straightened abruptly. "Don't let him get like that," she said, harsher now. "I won't," Daniel said. "I swear." Toward morning, when the wind finally died, the babies slipped into deeper sleep. Daniel sagged into a chair, exhaustion pulling him down. Ruth studied him from across the room, noting the way his shoulders curved inward, the careful distance he kept from everything that wasn't his. "You hungry?" she asked abruptly. He blinked, surprised. "I mean, yes, but it's fine." She huffed. "Sit still." She ladled out thin soup and set it in front of him. He ate like a man who hadn't expected kindness to last, slow at first, then with quiet urgency. "They don't have names." Ruth asked, nodding toward the babies. Daniel hesitated. Not yet. I didn't think it mattered if we kept moving. Ruth's chest tightened. It matters, she said, then added, quieter, eventually. Dawn crept in pale and unsure. Daniel woke with a start, apologizing for falling asleep. You meant to, Ruth said. Your body just didn't wait for permission. Breakfast came together without discussion. By mid-morning it was clear the babies weren't ready to move. One ran warm again, fussing no matter how careful Daniel was. They're staying another night, Ruth said, not looking at him. Maybe two. Relief flickered across his face. I'll work, he said immediately. Fix fences, chop wood, you don't work to earn mercy, Ruth cut in. You work because there's work to be done. He nodded. Days fell into a strange, familiar rhythm. Daniel worked sunup to sundown, hauling wood, patching boards, repairing a fence Ruth had meant to fix for years. He did it without complaint. Ruth watched from the porch, correcting him when he was wrong, pretending not to notice when he did it right the first time. Inside, the babies ruled the hours. They slept in short stretches, woke hungry, fussed endlessly, coughed just enough to keep Ruth alert. There were moments when the noise scraped at her nerves until her head throbbed. Once she snapped, sharp enough to startle the baby into silence. Ruth turned away quickly, jaw clenched. A minute later she knelt, smoothed a hand over the baby's head, voice low and steady. I'm sorry, she whispered. Daniel watched, awe and fear mingling. By the third day Ruth caught herself calling Daniel, the boy, under her breath. By the fifth it slipped out clearer, scolding him in a language he didn't understand but felt anyway. The babies grew stronger in stubborn increments. The coughing eased, the panic left their cries. Daniel learned the difference between hunger and discomfort, between fear and exhaustion. Ruth corrected him when he was wrong and said nothing when he was right. Exhaustion bound them tighter than affection ever could. Town noticed. A neighbor drove by slower. Someone left apples at the fence without knocking. Ruth pretended not to see until evening. Pressure followed. Polite questions. A councilman with clean boots and soft concern. We've had some questions, he said, glancing past Ruth toward the house. Children on the property. Everything here is my responsibility, Ruth replied. After he left, she stood on the porch long after his truck disappeared. I can go, Daniel said quietly. No, Ruth snapped, then steadied herself. They don't get to decide who belongs. The pressure didn't stop. Noise complaints. Hinted visits. A letter requesting records. Ruth read it once, folded it neatly, set it aside. They think I'll get tired, she said. I won't. Daniel grew quieter, jumpier at passing cars. Ruth locked doors tighter, kept the shotgun close, not as a threat but a reminder. One night Daniel told her the truth. About the baby's mother. About the man who followed. About the fight that ended wrong. About running because money and influence chased him faster than grief could catch up. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said quietly, I buried my son once. Loss doesn't ask permission. He admitted he'd planned to leave to protect her. I lost a child, Ruth said, each word deliberate. I don't lose another. The fear changed shape after that. It stopped asking him to run. It asked him to stand. The night the shed burned, the change proved itself. Smoke cut the air sharp. Flames climbed hungry. Rocks shattered glass. Voices murmured outside like distance made them safe. Ruth fired once into the air and the night split open. Silence followed. They fled. The shed collapsed into embers. Ruth didn't shake until after. She loaded the rifle, handed Daniel a flashlight. You take first watch, she said. I'll take second. Dawn came over blackened ground and standing walls. They wanted me quiet, Ruth said. They don't get to decide what survives here. The next day Daniel lifted a baby and a thin silver pendant slipped free. Ruth saw it and the world tilted. The chip along the edge. The memory of a chain slipping loose years ago. She said she'd lost a child. Then corrected herself. Not to the ground. To people who decided I didn't get to keep him. She didn't explain more. She didn't have to. I know what it feels like to lose a child, she said. And I know what it feels like to find one. The truth sat with them, heavy and warm. When men came again, slow and confident, Ruth stood on the porch with the rifle low and ready. Neighbors appeared. Sirens followed. The men retreated. Inside, the babies cried and settled again. That's not how family works, Ruth told Daniel when he offered himself to buy quiet. You stand. Afterward, neighbors brought supplies and stood watch without being asked. The house didn't sleep. In the days that followed, the watching eased. Cars stopped lingering. Kindness returned quietly. Ruth came home with papers. It's done, she said. Lands not challenged. The boys are registered. Names and all. The house exhaled. One evening, Ruth murmured, "Grandma's here," without thinking. She didn't take it back. Years passed. The house breathed. The boys grew loud with safety. Daniel learned when to step forward and when to hold steady. One night Ruth opened the wooden box and handed him the worn chain. You sure? He asked. She nodded. I am. On the porch under endless stars, he asked if she ever regretted it. No, she said. I regret what I was told to accept. When one boy asked why they didn't live somewhere else, Ruth smiled. Because this is where someone stayed. Daniel lingered at the doorway out of old habit. I just like knowing I'm here, he said. So do I, Ruth replied. Cedar Hollow never asked for attention. It held a quieter truth. Family was the place someone looked at you when it mattered and decided you weren't going anywhere. The drive north felt like riding into the past. The highway curled along the coastline, waves crashing against dark rock far below, the sky wide and endless in a way that made a person think about all the miles they'd traveled and all the ones still ahead. James kept his hands steady on the wheel, letting Margaret point out places she remembered. Old clubs that used to glow with neon and music. Corners where musicians gathered after midnight. Restaurants that were long gone now. The world had moved on, as it always does. But the memories still lived inside her. Do you miss it? James asked quietly as they passed a stretch of water shining under the afternoon sun. Margaret took her time answering. Sometimes, she said, but not the way I thought I would. Performing gave me moments. Teaching gave me something that lasts. I see pieces of myself in every student I help. That feels like a legacy. They reached San Francisco just as evening settled over the city. Lights flickered on across the hills, the air cool and familiar. Margaret stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, letting the past wash over her without fear. Destiny would arrive the next morning, flying in from Boston, but she had been oddly secretive about her plans. She kept saying she had a surprise. Margaret didn't press. The festival took place at the same grand hall where she had once stood under the lights, years before everything changed. Walking through the doors felt like stepping into a memory. The walls looked the same. The stage stood in the same place. But she was not the same woman. Back then she had walked in as a star. Now she entered quietly, almost like a guest in someone else's world. Over the next 2 days, Margaret attended performances, sitting among strangers, listening to young voices rise and fall with passion and precision. She ran into a few old musicians who remembered her warmly. Some hugged her, some seemed unsure what to say. Time had a way of shifting people apart. Still, the music felt like home. The night of the tribute came faster than she expected. James sat beside her in the audience, dressed in his best suit, his presence steady and reassuring. The program began with a series of performances. Singers stepped onto the stage one by one, each performing songs Margaret had once made her own. Hearing those melodies again was strange and beautiful. Some sang them differently, some stayed close to the originals. But every note reminded her of who she had been. Then the lights dimmed, old footage flickered onto a screen. There she was, younger, confident, standing under bright stage lights with a voice strong enough to quiet an entire room. The audience in the present watched in silence as the woman on the screen sang, her voice rich and full, commanding every inch of the stage. Margaret felt tears slide down her face. She had almost forgotten how powerful she once sounded. James leaned closer. You were incredible, he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak. When the footage ended, the festival director stepped forward. Margaret Sullivan gave this city some of its most unforgettable nights of music, he said. Tonight, we celebrate not just her voice, but the lives she's shaped since. He paused, then smiled. And we have one more surprise. A student who asked to honor her teacher. Margaret felt her heart jump. Destiny stepped onto the stage. She looked older, poised and strong, dressed simply but elegantly. The crowd quieted at once. Destiny took the microphone. Miss Margaret saved my life, she said. Her voice was steady, but filled with feeling. When my father and I met her, we were both carrying grief. She gave us purpose. She showed me what it meant to sing from the heart. Everything I am today began with her. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. This is a song she used to close her shows with, Destiny continued. Tonight, I sing it for her. The music began. Destiny's voice filled the hall, rich and controlled, layered with emotion. The song spoke of survival, of loss, of finding joy even after heartbreak. It was a tribute not just to Margaret's talent, but to her life. By the time the final note faded, the audience was already on its feet. But Destiny wasn't finished. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes searching until they found Margaret. Then she held out her hand. Miss Margaret, she called gently. Would you join me? Margaret froze. Fear rose up, sharp and sudden. Her voice wasn't what it used to be. It hadn't been for years. She shook her head slightly, but James squeezed her hand. Go on, he whispered. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the stage. The applause seemed to follow her every step. Destiny hugged her tightly the moment she reached her. I'm not asking you to sing, she murmured. Just stand with me. Margaret nodded, tears still falling. Destiny turned back to the microphone. We're announcing something tonight, she said. Miss Margaret and I are starting a scholarship at the Academy. It will help students who have talent but no way to afford lessons. We're calling it the Second Chances Fund. The crowd erupted in cheers. Margaret felt her heart swell. A second chance. That was exactly what she had been given. Destiny leaned close again. I know your voice isn't the same, she whispered. But it's still beautiful. Will you sing one verse with me? Just one. Margaret hesitated. Pride and fear battled inside her. But she looked out at the faces in the audience. At James standing below the stage, eyes shining with encouragement. At Destiny waiting beside her. One verse, she said quietly. The music began again, softer this time. Destiny sang the first lines alone, her voice warm and steady. Then she nodded gently. Margaret took a breath. Her voice came out rough, fragile, nothing like it once was. But it was real. Destiny's voice wrapped around hers, lifting it, supporting it, turning it into something whole. Together, they sang. And somehow, that moment felt more powerful than any performance Margaret had given in her youth. The audience listened in complete silence. When the final note faded, the applause came like a wave. Back at the hotel later that night, the three of them sat together, exhausted and happy. Destiny kicked off her shoes and curled into a chair. James loosened his tie. Margaret sat quietly, still trying to absorb everything. Thank you, she said finally, for bringing me back here. James smiled. That day at the diner, I thought I was helping you. Turns out, you helped us just as much. Destiny nodded. We needed you. And you needed us. Margaret laughed softly. I had $7 that day. That was all I had left. And it was enough, James said. Enough to put you in the right place at the right time. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each thinking about the road that had brought them together. 4 years passed. Destiny finished school and began building a career of her own. Margaret kept teaching, her studio always full. James expanded his shop, turning it into a place known for fairness and kindness. They still returned to Rosie's Diner every year on the anniversary of the day they met. They ordered the same meals, sat at the same counter, and always paid for an extra plate for someone who might need it. Years later, Margaret finally retired at 90. Her body had grown tired, but her spirit was still strong. On her final day at the academy, students filled the room. Some had traveled from across the country to be there. Destiny, now a grown woman with a voice known around the world, stood beside her and sang, "What a Wonderful World," one last time. When the song ended, Margaret stepped forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I started with $7, she said. And I ended up with a fortune I never expected. Not in money, in love, in purpose, in the people I got to help." She looked out at all the faces before her. If you think your best days are behind you, they're not. You're one moment away from everything changing. One act of kindness away from a new beginning. The applause lasted a long time. Margaret passed peacefully 2 years later, surrounded by James, Destiny, and students who had become family. At her funeral, Destiny sang again, her voice steady despite her tears. She used to say $7 changed her life, she told the crowd. But it wasn't the money. It was being seen. It was being given a chance. The scholarship grew. More students found their way because of it. James stayed involved until he grew old too, always believing that helping someone in need was the most important work there was. Destiny recorded an album named after that small moment that started it all. And every year, on the same date, she returned to that little diner. Sometimes alone, sometimes with her children, she ordered the same meals, left an extra plate paid for, and looked around for someone who might be counting change, just like Margaret once had. Because she knew what one small act could do. $7 had never been about the money. It had been about kindness. About noticing someone who felt invisible. About offering a hand when someone had almost given up. And the circle kept turning. One afternoon, years later, a young woman sat at the counter at Rosie's Diner, counting the last of her coins. At a nearby table, a mother and her teenage son were celebrating his acceptance into college. The woman noticed the girl. She remembered the story her own mother used to tell. The story about $7 and a second chance. She stood, walked over, and smiled. "Would you like to join us?" she asked gently. "We're celebrating, and celebrations are always better when you share them." And just like that, the story began again.